already evidence, and there are interventions that have proven to be effective in this matter. So there is clearly a gap. And teachers need to engage. They need to have the opportunity to engage with new research and evidence to understand how they can help all of the students to learn basic skills and to develop. But also education systems need the evidence to understand how they can support teachers and schools. And for example, there's a lot of evidence on what effective teacher professional development looks like. And policymakers need to engage with that evidence to create these opportunities for teachers. And as I said, this is just one aspect, and there are a million others. But just to highlight that improving student learning and making education systems more efficient and more equitable requires that using education research actually becomes a vital part of policy and practice. So, okay, what does this whole research mobilization thing encompass? And before I go into that, just two quick words about research. So I use research here. I noticed that Raul used knowledge mobilization, and I actually think that's a better term because it shows that knowledge has diverse sources and it's broader. But in my presentation, I will be focusing specifically on mobilizing research evidence. When I say research, I mean this in a broad sense. So any kind of systematic inquiry that is aiming to explore aspects of teaching and learning and education systems is research. So this includes data, large-scale data, but not only. It includes RCTs and intervention studies, but not only. It also includes qualitative studies, etc. When it comes to research mobilization, again, I mean this very broadly. So any kind of effort, intentional effort, that aims to facilitate the use of research evidence would be research mobilization. I will go into details later. So as a good OECD soldier, I will overwhelm you with data charts. But just to say that perhaps the most important thing is not the actual data that I'm going to show you, but the different aspects that it looks at. The data is coming from the policy survey that we conducted in this project, in which we asked ministries of education about the various actors, mechanisms, and barriers related to using research in policy and practice. And we had responses from 37 education systems representing 29 countries. So a quick reminder, note of caution, this is ministry's perspective. Clearly, it is a specific perspective. We could say it's biased, surely it is. It's still a very important perspective, I would say. But just to keep in mind when I show you the data that this is what ministries think. So let's start with the big question. Are countries happy with research use? It seems not so much. Only less than half of ministries thought that the extent to which research is used in policy and practice is not satisfactory. So how much? And also the ways in which it's used is not quite satisfactory in the majority of the systems. They see that it's even less satisfying in practice than in policymaking. So clearly, there is room for improvement according to ministries. So a few words about how we should think about knowledge mobilization and how our thinking has evolved in this field. So in the 90s, early 2000s, when the whole evidence-informed policy and practice agenda gained importance at the beginning, the focus was primarily on linear processes. So we were talking about disseminating and communicating research, facilitating access to research through user-friendly tools, and perhaps linking research production to policy and practice needs, for example, through commissioning research. And these are extremely important elements. But very quickly, we discovered that just giving access to research, even if it's in user-friendly format, does not guarantee its use. Absolutely not. One thing we really need is relationships. So building relationships between people, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, building professional partnerships and networks, but also developing their skills and capacity to engage with research. both those of policymakers and practitioners, but also researchers, actually, to be able to communicate their research more effectively. So, okay, relationships are important, but unfortunately still not enough, because this whole thing sits in a system. And it's absolutely crucial to understand how you can create incentives for the different actors, how you can create infrastructure and mechanisms, what good strategic leadership means, and how you can reward impact. So you actually need a systems perspective if you really want to think seriously about improving research mobilization. This is not to say that we moved from linear to relational to systems. It's to say that all of the three are extremely important. So one of the things we asked in our survey from ministries is, who are the actors who play some kind of role in facilitating research use in policy? And so what we can see here is that actually this field is very diverse, the landscape of actors. There are lots of different actors that play a role. So this is just with respect to policy. So of course, ministries see themselves and government funding agencies and policy networks as important actors. And many ministries actually have, more and more ministries have knowledge units and analytical units. In some countries, these are called education labs. Some of them are very new and very recently established. In some countries, they are more well established and exist for a longer time. But these units are specifically responsible for brokering evidence. Then research organizations, the green ones here, the size of the rectangle here represents the number of countries that thought that this actor was important or active in this field. So research organizations were seen as active, not a big surprise. But then you can see that there are lots of different other actors that also play a role: consulting firms, professional development providers, teacher education institutions, and so on. Interesting that brokerage agencies, so these are really formal agencies that have an explicit mandate to facilitate research use, and John Kay will be a perfect example with the Education Endowment Foundation, who does this work. So these agencies don't exist in every country. They actually exist in about half of the countries, and even in these countries, in some of them, they were not seen as active by the ministry. This could be because they are very new, or for any other reason. But just to say that this is a very diverse landscape, and we really need to take into account all of the different actors. So clearly, research mobilization is a complex field, and improving research use requires really acting on the whole system and understanding who does what. Okay, so what are the key ingredients of research mobilization? Let's start with the basics, with the linear ingredients. First of all, we actually need accessible and relevant research. So here you can see ministries' perspectives on the different types of research. Good news is that most ministries think that all of these different types of research are relevant. In terms of accessibility, there is still room for improvement. So about 60% of ministries think that these types of research are accessible, quite accessible, highly accessible, much less so. But clearly there is still an issue about accessibility that could be improved. So when it comes to mechanisms that exist in the different countries, the most widely reported one is providing targeted funding for research on specific topics. This is the bottom piece here. So this exists in 70% of the systems for both policy and practice. Policy here is the dark red, practice is the yellow bar. So that's great news. Synthesizing and disseminating research findings through user-friendly tools, also something that exists in the majority of countries, although still lacking in quite a few. When it comes to systematically identifying policymakers and practitioners' needs in terms of research, or identifying research gaps systematically, that exists in less than half of the system. So this is something that is still missing in many places. And we can also see that this is reflected in the barriers. So about half of the systems reported that there is a lack of the relevant research is still lacking for policy. And this is a major barrier. And that the low accessibility of research in appropriate formats was also reported as a very important barrier. Quality was not so much of a concern, which is probably good news. Oops. So let's move to the relational aspects. Projects that encourage interactions among actors to facilitate research use were the most widely reported mechanisms. Fantastic. In almost all systems, they now have projects that encourage interactions, at least in practice, slightly less so in policy, but still. When it comes to developing capacity and skills among policymakers and practitioners to actually engage with research, that's less present. And actually, you can have projects, but if you don't have the skills and the capacity building behind this, that may be a problem. And when we look at the barriers, we do see that low levels of skills and capacity were reported as a barrier, especially for practice, lack of learning opportunities as well. And lack of relationships still a barrier, despite the fact that there are projects. Of course, you can laugh. So this is where I like to emphasize that it's reported by ministries of education. So they see themselves as policymakers as having those skills, which one can doubt, but it might also be true. So let's look deeper into these skills aspect. So we identified 3 types of main skills related to research use. One is just very basic research literacy skills. So it's about evaluating the quality of the research, understanding and interpreting what the research says, and actually just finding and accessing relevant research for specific needs. So it seems like that most countries report that policymakers and practitioners have these basic skills, although for practice, this 55% to me is a bit like a glass half full, half empty. So there are still a lot of systems where apparently teachers do not have these very basic skills. The second type is using research. So it's about translating and applying education research to solve problems in their context, communicating it for their peers. So these exist in fewer systems for practice. And then the third type is about research production. So it's about formulating research needs and commissioning research based on these needs, supervising the production of research, and co-designing and co-conducting research with researchers. Now, there is still a question of whether everyone needs these skills, and perhaps not. Perhaps not every teacher needs to be able to produce research. There are also a lot of open questions still about research co-production, how effective this is, how useful this is. So I just wanted to note that. But also it seems to be a very promising avenue for teachers and researchers to kind of communicate and engage with each other and develop partnerships, because it seems to facilitate teachers' engagement with research in general. So let's look at the systems, mechanisms, and barriers. No surprise. System mechanisms are the ones that were the least reported. It's really only a handful of countries that have a systems approach to this. Regular and system-wide activities that monitor and evaluate the impact of research only exist in a few systems. Legislation, law, guidelines that promote the use of research only in very few systems. In some, they do exist, which is interesting. For example, in Sweden, it's part of the law that teachers should be engaging with research. And then a system-wide strategy for facilitating the use of research also only exists in only few systems. And again, no surprise, these kinds of systemic barriers were the most reported ones across countries: lack of financial resources, lack of mechanisms that facilitate the use of research, lack of broader political will, conflicting time frames. Lack of time is a really important one. And of course, if we want policymakers to engage with research and teachers, then we actually need to dedicate and allocate specific time for that. Just one more word about resources, because it's extremely important, and it's actually really great news that initiatives such as KIX are supported, because we need money for this, and not just money, we need all different types of resources. Soft infrastructure with networks, for example, human resources, supportive leadership, of course, money, financial resources, and adequate time to access and use research as well. And as you can see, these are still scarce mostly across the world. Now, this is something that I think is actually really important, and it's about developing a culture of research engagement. And developing that culture includes aspects such as motivation. It's interesting and promising to see that in our data, at least, most countries reported that the motivation is there, that using education research is important for policy and practice, that policymakers and practitioners are expected to use research, and there is a strong political will. When it comes to willingness, whether they are willing to try new ways to integrate education research, their processes to learn new skills, these are still reported by the majority of systems. I think an extremely important one is the third one here in the willingness bar. Policymakers and practitioners are willing to use education research to question their ideas and preconceptions. We are a stubborn species. It's hard for all human beings to challenge our own ideas and preconceptions and admit that we were wrong about something. So this, I think, is a really important skill actually to learn. And there is research, so it should question what I actually do. And the third part is, for me, an alarming point. This is the quality aspect of relationships. And what we can see is that there is a high level of trust in research itself among policymakers and practitioners is something that is not a given. In many systems, there isn't a high level of trust. Same thing, there is a high level of trust between researchers and policymakers/practitioners, still doesn't exist everywhere. And policymakers, practitioners, and researchers don't necessarily have a shared understanding of what education research is and how to use it. And these things are really important conditions for facilitating research use. But also these conditions develop over time through partnerships and relationships. So overall, what we can see is there are actually a lot of mechanisms that countries report that facilitate research use, but despite this, there are key barriers that remain. So some mechanisms still lack, and some may be ineffective or insufficient, or not well coordinated at the level of the system. And this, again, is something for which I think initiatives such as KIX is really important, because it can play a system-level coordination role, which is actually very important. So how to move forward from here? First of all, there are still gaps in our knowledge about knowledge mobilization. So we have seen that the intermediary field is very diverse. There are many, many different actors that perform different activities. But who does exactly what? So characterizing these activities across these different types of organizations is kind of missing. And the other missing piece is that we know very little about the impact and effectiveness of knowledge mobilization activities. And we need to understand the scope of the intermediaries' work, but also the impact and the challenges that they face. This is actually the next step in the project that we are doing at the OECD, and we have recently launched a survey of knowledge mobilization in which we would like to try at least to answer some of these questions. Now, for countries and for these participants, how can you move forward? So in our SARI governing board, we have a very high-ranking official from an important country who said at the beginning of this project that this is a very important project. I want a checklist. I want you to tell me with this project what I should be doing in my country to make this work. And this is obviously giving me a headache, because kind of the definition of a complex system is that there is no checklist. It's very difficult to make a checklist. But I tried something instead of a checklist. On the left side of this column, what you can see are different types of knowledge mobilization activities. So these include research generation and especially synthesizing existing evidence, dissemination, research dissemination, and advocating for research use, relationships and network building, capacity building, training, organizational development, so supporting, for example, schools or supporting ministries and policy organizations to better integrate research evidence in their processes in general, supporting interventions or research use specifically in a process. For example, I don't know, a country wants to reform its curriculum, then actually supporting their curriculum with evidence. And the last one is evaluation and system-wide development of knowledge mobilization in general. So this is a typology that was developed by my team, and I'm not saying this is comprehensive, but perhaps it's a good start to think about knowledge mobilization. And then we have to think about who does it, who does these things, who are the actors. Are there any activities that are not done by anyone, maybe? Do we have resources for this? Do we have infrastructure for all of these activities? Do we have appropriate incentives? And do we have leadership? So this is just a suggestion of a potential map that one could develop or think about to just start thinking about, okay, how we can improve this field, what is already there and what is still missing. I'm actually just testing this, so I would be happy to hear from you about how you would react. Does this sound useful or not? But this is instead of the checklist. So with that, I would like to thank you very much. These are the two reports that we have recently published. So I would be happy to send it around, and I'm here if you have any questions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Nora. Voy a hablar en español, usar la interpretación que está en el Zoom. Muchas gracias por tu presentación. Muy interesante lo que nos planteas, también muy concreto lo que nos propone en esta lista. Decirle a los asistentes y a las asistentes que pueden escribir sus preguntas en el chat y al final tendremos un espacio de preguntas y respuestas con todos los exponentes. Agradecer nuevamente y solo recalcar, muy interesante el punto en la articulación que propones entre los investigadores y los profesores, ¿no? Y los docentes, que haya esta conversación entre ellos. No necesariamente el docente tiene que ser investigador, pero también es muy importante que entienda los fundamentos básicos de la investigación para que también pueda transmitirlo, con el sentido también de empoderar al docente, que bien lo decías también en tu presentación, y lo fundamental de identificar a los actores, ¿no? A los actores claves y todos los tipos de actores que pueden apoyar en el uso de la investigación en las políticas educativas, también creo que son elementos claves. Muchas gracias nuevamente, Nora, y al final vamos a retomar las preguntas del público. Ahora, y en función y en honor al tiempo, vamos a pasar a nuestra segunda presentación, que se titula Abordar la brecha entre conocimiento y acción, atendiendo mejor las necesidades de evidencia de los responsables de políticas educativas, que está a cargo de la doctora Susan Grant-Lewis. La doctora Susan Grant-Lewis trabaja en la mejora de las oportunidades educativas a través de la política y la planificación. Actualmente trabaja en Educationorg. Fue directora de IP UNESCO entre el 2014 y el 2021, cofundadora del International Education Funders Group, coordinadora de la Fundación Partnership for Higher Education in Africa y miembro del cuerpo docente de la Universidad de Harvard entre 1997 y 2006. Y tiene un doctorado en la Universidad de Stanford. Adelante, Nora. Susan, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I hope you're, are you seeing my presentation now? Sorry. You're right, just switch to the screen one. And move on to the presentation. Sorry about that. Two monitors, right. I trust that you're not seeing my notes and just the slides, I hope. Okay, super, thank you. Well, I really want to warmly thank SUMA, OECS, IDRC, and GPE for the opportunity to exchange with the KIX LAC group, particularly with the focus on the use of evidence for institutional change. It's also a privilege to share this virtual stage with Nora and John. Thank you. So I'd like to cover the following 5 points. Most of you don't know anything about education.org, understandably, given our youth. So I'd like to explain who we are and how we understand this gap, which we call the knowing-doing gap. And then share with you what we've learned about policymakers' evidence use and needs. And you will hear a lot of echoes to what Nora has said. And then I'm going to make the case for widening the sources of evidence that are used by all of us, and then finish off with a real brief presentation of where we're going through 2028, and close with an invitation to engage with us. Whoops. So first of all, we're an independent nonprofit initiative, just 3 years old, and we see evidence access and use as very much the focus of our work. Our mission is focused on access and use of evidence, which we define very broadly. And it's important to note that we do not engage in generation of research. We're aiming to be a constructive disruptor, that is trying to shake up the status quo and challenge some of the conventional wisdom and approaches. And we have an interesting education evidence pathway, which I'll turn to in a few minutes. Since we began our work in 2020, Education.org has been focused on establishing the exact needs of education leaders, with a particular focus on ministries of education. And we did a review of about 45 organizations globally, conducted over 80 interviews with education sector leaders from global, regional, and national. And we concluded that the gap between what we know and what we actually do lies at the heart of our global learning crisis. We issued a white paper to advance evidence use in education. And we called for building an education knowledge bridge, because we argue that it's not the lack of new research that is the greatest obstacle to progress, but the failure to use what we already know. So we also identified in this white paper, which is on the left of your screen, ways to bridge that knowing-doing gap. And it starts with the research generation, really promoting the end use and user focus from the very beginning. So that affects the kinds of work, the kinds of research that is done, the kinds of issues that are chosen, etc. Secondly, synthesis, trying to build the big picture, including frontline unpublished evidence, so from practitioners, for example. Thirdly, to have actionable guidance for decision makers, answering that so what? What does it mean for the users? And fourthly, as Nora spoke about, we need an enabling environment, building a culture in country of evidence use. And the white paper goes into much more extended discussion about how education sector compares with health, where there's been many, many decades of a culture of evidence use. And then finally, for implementation, we need to engage and support change at scale. Turning now to policymaker evidence and use, what have we been learning? So we reviewed 21 policy and planning documents for this period, 2015 to 2019. It's a small sample, and it was really only focused on the 2 countries that we were working in, Kenya and Sierra Leone. But we found that 57% of those documents didn't cite any, cited some sources rather. 15% of the evidence sources, what we would call a source of evidence, was locally generated, meaning it came from within the region, and mostly from individual countries, but 27% of those were regional. And it's fascinating that of those 12 policy documents that had citations, they were almost all created with an external international partner. UN partner, World Bank, international NGO, bilateral, what have you. So we also, from our interviews for the white paper, and since then, we've had several other comments to find. Policymakers are often relying on government documents, government data, including from other ministries. But this is particularly obvious during COVID. Policymakers report that they use what they can access easily and quickly. They only use sources they trust, that they find credible. Again, echoing what Nora was talking about in OECD countries. And they don't use elite academic sources if they don't speak to them. And for some, they stopped looking at them because they don't speak to them. They've not found any that actually speak to them. So what do policymakers actually want? Well, they want reports that are written for decision makers, not for researchers. They want analysis that's forward-looking, not backwards. They want studies that match government priorities, not the donor priorities. And this is tied to this issue of trust. There's a lot of concern about vested interests in some of the research that is done from the government perspective, particularly research that's done to promote a donor-biased agenda, or that is kind of sidelined by political interests. Again, they want sources they can trust without vested interest. They want sources that capture the real world experience, kind of frontline contributions, especially if it's from their own country or from the region they're in. They want evidence synthesis that is contextually relevant with actionable guidance. They want easier access to studies and reports. They want tech tools for better, quicker access to data. In some countries, even getting a hold of EMIS data within a ministry is quite a chore. But they, on the positive side, they want partnerships with researchers and practitioners. They see them as having expertise that ministries need, but they would like to have greater reciprocity, more of a partnership. They know that many researchers see their role as holding government accountable, but there should be a two-way street. And they would like to see channels or mechanisms to hear what practitioners are working on, how they're progressing, and what are they learning. Here are a couple of quotes from two former ministers of education. Research reports are not readily available. Even when you find the evidence, it's written for everybody but a policymaker. It takes a lot of time to figure out what it means for decisions. And another one, much of the studies show a lack of alignment of donor funding with government transitions. Often that work is working on what were previous priorities. So there's a complaint that donors who are funding research don't move fast enough when there's a change in government or changing government priorities. So what we've been learning from education decision makers, especially those in government, has really influenced the model that we're using for developing evidence syntheses, as our evidence pathway shows. And we have four main pieces of this. First of all, source widely. So here we work with education leaders to define their priorities, then source the most relevant evidence globally, including locally generated, previously underused and unpublished, sometimes called gray literature. We're trying to synthesize rigorously, obviously, to create a coherent picture from this mass of evidence and findings, appraising the sources for not just methodological purposes, because a lot of these sources, in fact, are not research, but rather to appraise for quality, relevance, and context, distilling the key conclusions. And from there, generate some insights. So put it forward and translate these findings into plain language, actionable insights for leaders to use, be they at national, regional, or global education level for policies, plans, and investments. And then finally, paying attention to uptake. So sharing the guidance with decision makers, and that might be through in-person activities or what have you, but it takes a longer term commitment in a country to move this forward. So with this aim of sourcing widely to better serve education decision makers, Educationorg convened a technical working group. And in June, we pulled together, we had a meeting co-convened with one of our partners, USAID. So the purpose of this international working group, whose work is ongoing, and I'm proud to say Jonathan Kay is an active member of it. First of all, we want to build on existing appraisal guidance for published research. Very rigorous appraisal guidance exists, but we want to develop new, coherent, intellectually rigorous system for the non-traditional sources that we find better serve education decision makers. And to develop the guidance, and we have 3 parts to this guidance that we're working on. To classify, because gray literature or these other sources it's a big universe of things. So to classify it. And here we're looking at what kinds of analytic purposes, if you have a particular analytic question, what kinds of sources might you turn to, and mapping it that way. Like if you're trying to understand barriers to implementation, yes, there may be a fabulous journal article that's come out, but what about the program implementation reports, for example, which typically are not published? Okay. The second part of the guidance is focused on how to find this and access these sources. Gray literature is famously difficult to access. That's why it's gray, called gray. And we want to really make it a bit easier for knowledge producers to take the effort, a little bit of effort, to enrich the sources that they're using. And then finally, the guidance is coming up with suggestion on how to appraise these sources. Again, these sources are unpublished, often locally generated and practice-derived sources. Now, the membership of the IWG includes people who are active in the evidence ecosystem, be it at global, regional, or country level. And they're playing different roles. So we've got policymakers, researchers, synthesizers, practitioners, and funders. And we have quite senior representation from 27 different organizations, and 9 African countries are engaged there. Who's going to use this guidance? Well, the targeted users for this are really not your permanent secretary or your minister of education in a country. It's really the knowledge producers, researchers, synthesizers, consultants, practitioners, and those in government who are tasked with doing analysis to broaden their perspective and make it a lot easier for them. We debated a considerable amount about why is it important to expand the range of evidence available? And there are many reasons. First of all, you've got the demand from decision makers, and particularly policy makers. We need to recognize what gets used and how policy is actually made. Secondly, we would argue, and I'll come to the principles now, that that an expanded range of evidence enriches the quality of the evidence base. It's kind of the diversity argument. There's power in combining research, practical applications, real life experiences. So here are the 7 key principles that we agreed to in June that we're trying to make more concrete in the guidance that we're developing. Really have in mind the focus of the user and their needs at the start. Secondly, recognize context matters immensely, certainly to the user, and that interpretation of a given source has to be within a context. Sometimes something that you wouldn't accept in a rigorous lit review funded by FCDO, in fact, is the best available piece of evidence in a country. We have had lots of conversations about terminology, and really decided that the question is less about published, not published, and also that we've set aside the idea that peer review is some quality measure, that it's very, very much contested. Depends on the journal, I recognize, but that's one of the things we've talked about. Given what policymakers have said to us, we need to attend to credibility and trustworthiness of the source. This is not so simple or straightforward, and we're grappling with this. When we talk about making available best available evidence, we need to remember it has to be affordable and accessible, including language accessible. So here we are with the key principles of the International Working Group as they develop the guidance. So here's our timeline. We had the convening in June. We're currently working on iterations of the draft guidance with those three main pieces that I mentioned: classify, identify and access, and appraise. And we will be trialing them, the guidance in a number of settings. We'll be trialing them in Kenya and Sierra Leone later in 2023 into 24. And 12 of the IWG organizations volunteered to provide feedback, either by using them, having an in-house seminar, or sharing it with some of their grantees or their partners to trial. We'll pull all this feedback together in a learning roundtable next April, May, June, and then revise it and disseminate it for very publicly. And we hope that, so in a minute, I'll tell you how you can get involved. Now, Education.org is planning the second phase of our organizational growth, taking us through 2028. And we're trying to build on the lessons we've learned, further systematize our work, and invest in scaling up activities to expand our impact. So we have these three strategic goals. The first one, ambitious, to establish an evidence synthesis gold standard for education system leaders. So this is very much building on our prototype evidence synthesis that we had, that's on accelerated education programs, particularly for out-of-school youth. And those are available on our that's available on our website if you're interested. So we're trying to strengthen this new method of doing evidence syntheses for leaders who are shaping the decisions about education systems. The second goal is, for the moment, our country engagement is really focused on the African continent, with partnerships with ministries in Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Uganda. And it's very much based on existing policy planning processes. And the aim is to try to increase both the commitment and the capacity to put evidence at the center of education decision-making. And our third goal is about, building this education knowledge bridge, very much in partnership with others, to elevate. In particular, we want to elevate the evidence needs that are related to those most marginalized. So put those children and youth at the forefront, and amplify marginal voices as well, which includes the inclusion of locally generated evidence. So I invite you all to join us. If any of you have guidance that you're using for your evidence gathering, we'd love to see it. We're happy to share ours. By the end of the year, we'll be able to share a draft that you may want to give feedback on. And of course, when it is publicly available, we hope that you'll help us with the dissemination and continuous updating of this work. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Susan. Muy interesante lo que nos planteas. También quiero agradecer a los 4 ponentes, ¿no?, que tenemos hoy día, expositores y expositoras. Es fantástico contar con Nora, contar con Susan, contar con Jan, y contar también con nuestro director de Suma, Javier González, en esta jornada. Así que nuevamente muchas gracias. Susan, muy interesante lo que nos planteas. Me quedo con algunos puntos específicos en relación a esta brecha, ¿cierto?, entre saber y hacer, y que esto es parte de la crisis del aprendizaje, que es la que ustedes también intentan hacerse cargo, que la investigación sea relevante en el contexto, ¿cierto?, en el cual se va a aplicar, este punto de más reciprocidad entre los investigadores y los tomadores de decisiones. Creo que también es un punto fundamental, es muy importante, por lo menos en América Latina y el Caribe. Pensamos también que la guía es un elemento fantástico para trabajarlo y fortalecer el acceso a la literatura gris también es un punto muy interesante porque es verdad que es de difícil acceso, que muchas veces es como una fuente más secundaria, pero que es muy importante tenerla presente para las investigaciones que se realizan. Así que, nuevamente, muchas gracias por tu intervención. Recordar que va a haber un espacio para las preguntas, así que pueden ahí escribirlas en el chat con sus preguntas, felicitaciones o lo que quieran
I
compartir.
forgot to say that, yeah, just wanted to add, I failed to say, Suma, both Raul and Javier are active members in the International Working Group, and I want to thank them for their commitment as well.
Gracias, Susan. Vamos a continuar entonces en honor al tiempo nuestra tercera presentación que se titula Integrar la evidencia en los sistemas escolares a cargo de Jonathan Kay. Jonathan Kay es responsable del trabajo de síntesis de evidencias de guía, incluido el kit de herramientas de enseñanza y aprendizaje, un portal de evidencia utilizado por el 70% de los líderes escolares en Inglaterra. John ha estado en el IEF desde el 2014 desempeñando varias funciones, incluida la dirección del equipo de políticas y la publicación de informes de evaluación sobre ensayos controlados aleatorios financiados por el IEF. Antes de estar en esta institución, trabajó en el National Education Trust y en un proyecto de investigación sobre el uso de mensajes de texto para aumentar la participación de los padres. Es miembro honorario de la Universidad de Durham. Muchas gracias, John, y adelante.
So I think my screen is showing now. Just get it into slide view. So yeah, thanks everyone. And I think that what I'll talk about today will really nicely build on what Nora and Susan will be saying, hopefully echoing and not contradicting each other, because I think there's a lot of alignment here. And I think what I'll be talking about essentially is a case study of how we've tried to embed evidence use in the education system in England and some of the lessons that we have learned along the way. So a little bit about the EEF. So we are the What Works Centre for Education in England. We've had some really powerful and long-standing partnerships, particularly with Summa, from whom we've learned a lot around the policy use of evidence, and we've had a very long and fruitful relationship. But we basically do 3 activities that are aimed at closing the socioeconomic disadvantage gap that exists in schools in England. We look at evidence generation, so that problem that Nora mentioned around how do we have high quality relevant evidence that actually speaks to the needs of practitioners and policymakers. And we spend a lot of time trying to target research and fund research that actually answers those questions that matter to people. And then the 2 areas that I'll talk about a bit more today, which is evidence synthesis. So how do we pull that evidence together in a really accessible but also rigorous way? And then evidence mobilization. So how do we move from evidence just being accessible on a website to people actually using it to change behaviors? And I think one of the key challenges that we face in trying to change outcomes for children in England is this key question that Nora was examining in some of the barriers to evidence use, and I think is kind of the first point in the theory of change of using evidence. So is evidence actually being accessed, and is evidence then being used? And what are the reasons if it's not? Because I think the answer is clear that it certainly isn't consistently across systems or consistently with high quality. What are the ways that we can get around that challenge, and what are the current causes of that challenge? And so what we do in this area is really focus on evidence synthesis. And the question we ask ourselves is, how can we summarize evidence in a way that is trustworthy? So it can't just give someone an easy answer and then that answer actually leads to poorer outcomes. We need to build trust with practitioners and policymakers that the evidence is giving them answers that they care about, but also answers that are actually true. It needs to be accessible, and then it needs to actually be actionable. So it's all very well if it's very easy to read, but if you don't know how to actually act on it and change behaviors or outcomes, it's not going to make a big difference. And there are two challenges here that are interlinked. One is that the evidence that exists is really hard to access. And I think that we've all kind of seen the challenges of things that are hidden away in journals, behind academic paywalls or written in inaccessible language. And that's been covered really well already. I think another challenge isn't just about whether it's written in accessible language, but is actually about where you go to find it. So I think that, when we think about policymakers or practitioners accessing evidence, it's really useful to think about, what do we think that looks like in an ideal world? Do we think that looks like policymakers going to 20 different websites and trying to seek out the best journal articles because we've taught them how to be excellent researchers? Do we think that means them Googling and finding the top hits on a kind of Google result for evidence around something? Do we even think that's chatting to ChatGPT and hoping it gives them a good answer? And it's probably none of those things. What we probably want to do is develop places that are go-to sources for evidence that policymakers and practitioners can go to, so that the evidence is not only accessible in terms of language and in terms of being free to access, but also findable. And then the second related risk is, even if evidence is really accessible, if people just look at one or two studies, they may not get an accurate reflection of the evidence base overall. So sometimes that might be out of cynicism. So it's very easy to find one or two studies that just support your point of view. If there are 20 studies and I only tell you about the positive ones, then I could very easily make a case for action that may not be justified by the evidence. But it may just be by simple accident. So it might be that all you hear about, oh, sorry, there are automatic lights in this building. It might be that you only hear about the studies that are most famous, and as a result, you only get the outliers that don't give you a proper representation of the evidence base overall. And my favorite case study of this happens all the time in the UK news, is every other week we'll get a study that says that wine is a great way of curing cancer. And then the next week we'll get a study that says that wine is a great cause of cancer. And I know which ones that I'll choose to believe, but whether that's an accurate reflection of the evidence base is another question. So trying to see the evidence base and the studies overall can give us a much more balanced picture, and hopefully can give policymakers a more balanced picture. And just to kind of illustrate the kind of the difference that evidence translation can make, these are all of the studies that we found in the history of education relating to giving high quality feedback in education. And my question is, do we think that any policymaker or practitioner would be able to read all of these and engage with them in enough depth to get a proper understanding? So it keeps going. But a better way of understanding and engaging with that evidence is by accessible evidence synthesis. And so the teaching and learning toolkit that we produce aims to take all of that information from those studies and render it in a really accessible way. So showing how much it costs, because that's often an important consideration for policymakers, how good the evidence base is and how impactful it is. And then as well as that overall average, beginning to understand what sits behind that average. So what are the things that are more or less effective across those studies? And the fact that we can do this systematically, rather than picking and choosing studies at random, and render it in accessible language, allows people to engage in a way that is nuanced and rigorous as well as accessible. And this is one of the areas where we've done some really interesting partnership with SUMA, with their Effective Practices platform, that is a recontextualization of this global evidence base, incorporating specific evidence from across Latin America and the Caribbean to recontextualize the evidence and make it appropriate and accessible for policymakers across the KIX countries. So it's a really nice initiative there. And just across this, we don't just do it with feedback. There's 30 different topics, and the Teaching and Learning Toolkit allows us to take 3,500 studies that would otherwise be behind academic paywalls and make them accessible to teachers. Lots of teachers in England have this up as a poster on their wall. It has all of the impacts and outcomes they can read really quickly. And it's an introduction to engaging with evidence in a way that is really easy to do and shows the power that evidence can have in terms of decision making. And people often compare this to engaging with academia, and they get the idea that this is probably more accessible, more people are going to use it than a journal article, but I don't think they quite understand just how big the divide is. So these are some stats from a journal that's very popular in England. The average article being downloaded around 373 times over the course of a year. If you're really lucky, you get a nice open access article that seems relevant and interesting. So you go up to under 7,000 downloads in the year. When you compare that to access to the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, there's quite a big difference. So we've got 1.2 million people accessing the toolkit. And the reason I share that slide is because people understand that you need to translate evidence, but I don't think it's always easy to appreciate the sheer magnitude of the difference that we're talking about here. This isn't double, this isn't triple, it's many times over in terms of accessibility. And if we think that having access to evidence is a prerequisite to high quality evidence use, then that evidence translation, that high quality synthesis needs to be an essential part of any pathway to impact. But of course, all of those stats are only really about accessing the evidence. They're not about inspiring and mobilizing high quality use of the evidence, which is much more challenging. So I'm going to go through a bit of a case study of some activity that we've done in the early years around moving from evidence access to evidence use. I put up a QR code here because what you might want to do is look through this kind of recent resource as I talk through. I'll also put the link in the chat at the end so that people can look through it on their own time. But this is a recent resource that we've developed around supporting practitioners specifically in evidence-based practice in the early years. And this is really important. This is a picture mirrored across the world, but in England, children from disadvantaged backgrounds, socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, do worse in every single outcome in the early years, whether that's writing, whether that's speaking, motor skills, even creative things like creating with materials and building relationships. Across all of the measures we have in England, there is an equity gap. So evidence is a key part in trying to overcome this equity gap. And the early years evidence story is a really interesting example, I think, about how we're trying to work with practice to make evidence more relevant and then work with practice to ensure that it is acted upon. And specifically, I'm talking about interactions with practice as much as policymakers, because while policymakers are one part of the equation, actually a lot of the learning, a lot of the key influences of those outcomes happens in the interaction between early years practitioners and the children. And so we go through a process for the early years evidence store, where first we talk to practitioners to try and understand practice and come up with a taxonomy for what the different practices that matter in the classroom actually look like. So on the right, you can see the beginnings of the taxonomy. If you click into the evidence store, you'll see the many different practices that sit underneath this taxonomy. When we're talking about building early language, there are lots of different components or practices that sit underneath it. So at the very start of this process, we work with practice to understand what are the questions that matter that people want evidence about. We then move into understanding the evidence base. So we do systematic review, we understand the different sources of evidence that give us insight into whether these things are effective and then how to do them with high quality. But then I think that the most interesting things that we do in this process is the process of exemplification and then supporting implementation. So the first thing we do is actual written exemplification of what this might look like in the classroom. So a key barrier in terms of evidence use is often people are really bad at describing how do you actually do this. Once you've got the evidence that a practice is effective, what does it look like to do it in the classroom? So we have really clear examples of what it means to do high quality questioning with a child in an early years setting, and right up to essentially kind of the scripts of exemplar interactions. And we do these for all practices that we find high quality evidence-based. So you can see in the top left, there's questioning, there's posing suggestions or problems, there's imitation, there's recalling of events or experiences. And across each of these individual practices, we show what might good look like in order to support implementation. Then the really exciting thing we do is work with practitioners to film what it looks like and go into early year settings to show what would it actually look like to do this effectively. And I think this is a really nice example of where practice and evidence need to meet, because a study can't tell you what high quality evidence implementation actually looks like in the classroom. So on the website, you'll see these videos where we've worked with early year settings to demonstrate what it looks like to do each of these practices. But then, of course, even those videos, even those high quality examples of implementation might not be enough. So we think about other ways to support implementation. We think about scaling effective programs. So when there's bespoke training, where there are evidence-based initiatives, we make sure that there's capacity in the system that everybody can receive them. A nice example is the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, where we did 2 randomized control trials, found that program was very, very positive at improving outcomes, and it's now been scaled to over half of the primary schools in England. We embed evidence into teacher training, working with the Department for Education to ensure that where there's high quality practices that are found in early years education, that becomes a part of the training of our teachers. And we support school to school or setting to setting support around high quality implementation. So where we find schools that are examples of best practice and are embedding the evidence really effectively, we support them to share practice with settings nearby, because often schools or early year settings are more likely to listen to other schools and other early year settings in order to not only understand what the evidence says, but also how to apply it. And then we also work with policymakers to nudge schools towards evidence use through policy levers, such as additional funding to schools where there's a mandate to ensure that the justification for that funding spend relies on high quality evidence. So allowing schools to have autonomy in decision making, but encouraging them to go to sources of high quality evidence to support that decision making. So I think I'm just about at time. But in terms of some concluding thoughts, supporting evidence use in schools requires evidence to be available, accessible, but ultimately actionable. And that high quality exemplification that actually speaks to practice or speaks to policymakers is a really important part of ensuring that the evidence production process says something meaningful to schools. Working with practice needs to happen at all stages of the evidence process. So I think the most important thing around the early years evidence store was understanding with practitioners what are the areas that we need to summarize the evidence base in so that it actually speaks to their concerns. And the long-term changes in behaviors require multiple pathways to impact. So working with policymakers on teacher training and policy nudges, working with practitioners on understanding evidence and showing what evidence can look like, and working with other system actors such as high quality settings that spread influence around the system. So it's only by taking those things together that we stand the chance of making real change. And on the right, you can see some of the stats of some of the impacts that we've had in the English school system. One of the ones I'm most proud of is that 90% stat of the usefulness of EF resources during the pandemic. So that's objective, independent polling of schools that the Department for Education conducted, and EF resources were found to be more useful than anything put out by policymakers during that time. So hopefully a useful example of some of the work that we've done in England, and as I said, we continue to work really closely with SUMA on how to embed evidence successfully.
interesante, ¿no?, lo que nos plantea este kit de herramientas, pensando en varias, bien decías, ¿no?, que a veces uno puede estar un poco sesgado en torno a lo que decide tomar para utilizar de evidencia. Resulta muy práctica al momento de tomar decisiones, es una muy buena herramienta también y que por supuesto esta evidencia sea accesible, ¿no? Lo que tú decías, que lo más importante es que sea evidencia accesible y también con un lenguaje.
Me parece que se cayó la señal de Maciel, sí. Ahí volviste, Maciel.
Aquí estoy. Sí, ¿me escuchan? ¿Sí, todo bien? Ya, bueno, nuevamente al final de la presentación. Y ahora, en el día de hoy, que se titula Movilización de la evidencia para la justicia social en educación. Experiencias del sur global. A cargo del doctor Javier González. Javier González es economista, PhD y máster de la Universidad de Cambridge, Educación e Innovación. Es director y cofundador de Zoom. Ha ejercido cargos de responsabilidad en Chile en los gobiernos de Ricardo Lagos y Michelle Bachelet. Y en el plano internacional forma parte del grupo asesor de Red School Plus de la OECD. Ha sido asesor senior de distintos organismos en desarrollo, UNESCO, Banco Mundial, UK, Research and Innovation, UCRI, entre otros. A su vez, ha sido miembro del Consejo Directivo de la Fundación Chile y el Consejo.
¿Aló? Se cayó nuevamente Maciel.
Asesores de UNESCO y el Corfo. Adelante, Javier, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Nora, Susan, John, especially for being with us in this very important webinar about the importance of evidence and the way to impact through evidence our different policies in education in a very important moment after COVID, in which, of course, we need to not only recover, but of course, transform. My presentation, my slides are in English, but I will speak in Spanish to make a fair play for those who are listening from our region. So it would be in two languages somehow. So I will change to Spanish, and of course, for those who do not understand Spanish, you can change to the channel in the translating channel there in your Zoom screen. Bueno, muchas gracias, como decía, a todos y todas por estar presentes en esta importante reunión y presentaciones que hemos tenido, tanto de la OECD, ¿no es cierto?, como Educationorg, y también el Education Endowment Foundation, un largo y antiguo socio nuestro en esta importante tarea de promover la evidencia para mejorar nuestras políticas públicas en general. Quisiera partir entonces, quién sabe, ofreciendo una reflexión respecto a la manera como entendemos la evidencia y ser críticos respecto a que hasta hoy, yo creo que en eso compartimos, quién sabe, a través de las distintas experiencias que se han mostrado hoy día, pero también incluso algunos números que mostraba, por ejemplo, Nora, ¿no es cierto?, a través del informe tan importante de la OECD al respecto, que de alguna manera ocupamos poco la evidencia, pero quisiera yo, a partir de eso, centrarme en el foco de lo que buscamos, que lo que buscamos es mejorar nuestro sistema educativo, donde la evidencia es un ingrediente, pero no el foco, ¿no? El foco debiera estar en el cambio institucional, ¿ya? Institutional change should be our focus, ¿no es cierto? Entonces, lo que estamos diciendo es que si bien este seminario se trata de la evidencia, quisiera por un momento poner el foco en que lo que buscamos al final del día es tener una mejor educación. Cuando decimos mejor educación, una educación de mejor calidad, más equitativa e inclusiva, por cierto. Y la pregunta que nos lleva entonces a quienes hemos estado en políticas públicas, trabajando desde el gobierno, pero también desde agencias internacionales, la pregunta es, bueno, ¿por qué, si es que pareciera que hay internacionalmente un consenso, y a nivel nacional también, es cosa de ver las noticias y los políticos de distintos partidos y alianzas, pareciera que todos dicen queremos una educación de calidad, equidad e inclusiva, pareciera que no hay ningún conflicto, ¿no es cierto? Entonces la pregunta es ¿por qué no logramos movernos hacia adelante, ¿no? ¿Por qué es tan difícil entonces hacer las reformas que parecieran que la evidencia muestra que son las que hay que hacer, ¿no? Entonces la pregunta uno tiene que hacerse es, bueno, ¿es porque no sabemos? ¿Que los políticos no saben lo que hay que hacer? ¿Es que, quién sabe, no están dispuestos a hacer aquello que hay que hacer? ¿O simplemente no les importa la educación? ¿No es cierto? Vemos en distintas conversaciones que, quién sabe, siempre volvemos a este tipo de cosas, ¿no? O no les importa, o no saben, o realmente saben, les importa, pero no están dispuestos a poner su capital político. Entramos en ese tipo de conversaciones. Entonces, a la luz de eso uno dice, bueno, ¿cuál es la importancia de la evidencia entonces en ese contexto? Y yo lo que quisiera entonces, por eso digo, partir por entender que lo que buscamos todas nuestras instituciones tiene que ver con cómo hacer este cambio institucional. Por cambio institucional me refiero a cambiar instituciones, entendida como el Premio Nobel de Economía North, pero otros autores, ¿no es cierto?, definen como la regla del juego, ¿no? The rules of the game, ¿no es cierto? Es decir, cuando digo instituciones no me refiero a organismos, me refiero a las reglas tanto formales como informales que regulan nuestra interacción social, ¿no es cierto? Las reglas formales, me refiero a nuestra Constitución, muchas de ellas que están en reforma continua, o en algunos países, en América Latina últimamente, muy activamente en discusión, pero no solamente las constituciones, sino que las reglas, me refiero por nuestras leyes, normas principales que regulan el sistema educativo, tanto para los estudiantes, qué pasa con los estudiantes, quiénes tienen derecho a estar en la educación, quiénes tienen derecho a ser profesores de la educación, bajo en qué contexto, etcétera, todas las reglas que nos norman, pero también no solamente las reglas formales, sino que las reglas informales, que tienen que ver con muchas en cómo nos comportamos dentro de la sala de clase, en cómo interactuamos, ¿no es cierto?, dentro de una comunidad educativa. Esas distintas capas de reglas formales e informales es a lo que me refiero cuando digo cambio institucional. ¿Cómo hacemos que esos cambios y esas regulaciones que son visibles o invisibles, formales o informales, tienen un impacto en esa calidad, equidad e inclusión? Entonces, para entender eso, creo que aquí pongo algunos de los autores, ¿no es cierto?, que han estado trabajando en lo que es el tema del cambio institucional, es que debemos entender que el cambio institucional no es solamente que ocurra porque no sepamos algo, y por lo tanto no es que si tenemos más evidencia, ese cambio va a ocurrir. Las reglas no cambian simplemente porque nuestros parlamentarios, ¿no es cierto?, o líderes políticos, tanto de politics como de policy, ¿no es cierto?, no sepan. Muchas veces saben, pero hay otros drivers, hay otros palancas que hacen que cambie estas reglas. Entre ellas, si uno toma buena parte de la literatura y hacemos esta síntesis que estamos hablando, si ustedes quieren, sobre qué hace que haya un cambio institucional, lo que nos muestra la ciencia política, la economía institucional y la sociología es que hay principalmente tres grandes drivers. Por supuesto hay muchos, pero hay tres grandes palancas. Uno que tiene que ver con la eficiencia y la búsqueda de soluciones óptimas, ¿no es cierto? Es decir, una visión más funcionalista, donde decimos, a más evidencia vamos a poder llegar a mejores soluciones, y en la medida que esas soluciones resuelvan problemas colectivos, van a ser adoptadas, ¿no es cierto?, por los países, para hacer esos cambios institucionales, para cambiar las reglas de manera de poder hacer que el sistema funcione mejor. Pongo el caso de la repitencia. La repitencia es una regla de qué estudiantes pueden o no progresar a lo largo del sistema educativo. Bueno, cuando sistematizamos evidencia, ¿no es cierto? Y el IEF nos muestra el impacto negativo que tiene en términos de aprendizaje, y a eso le sumamos lo que sabemos que tiene el impacto negativo en términos de la trayectoria de los estudiantes, porque muchos terminan abandonando. Y además sabemos que genera un mayor costo, ¿no es cierto? Porque ese estudiante, por supuesto, está un año más. Nos damos cuenta que a nivel de solución de eficiencia, no debiera haber repitencia, al menos en la gran mayoría de los cursos. Obviamente hay que acompañar a ese estudiante de todas maneras, pero a nivel de regla habría que cambiarla. Y sin embargo, cuando miramos, vemos que muchos de nuestros países persisten con reglas que mantienen la repitencia en todos los niveles, incluso al principio. Un caso, por ejemplo, de América Latina, que es, digamos, icónico en este sentido, es Uruguay, que tiene altísimas tasas de repitencia, y por ende, muy relacionado a eso, altísimas tasas de abandono y deserción. Entonces la pregunta ¿es que Uruguay no sabe eso? Bueno, nosotros estuvimos en Uruguay haciendo focus group y nos dimos cuenta que en realidad el problema no es que no supieran que la repitencia era una mala medida. El problema era cultural, y ese es el segundo componente que nos muestra la evidencia de que es algo clave para el cambio institucional. Lo que nos mostraban los focus group con profesores es que los profesores veían que parte de cómo sus pares, es decir, los otros profesores lo evaluaban a ellos como ser un profesor de buena o mala calidad, dependía del porcentaje de alumnos que hagan repetir, ¿ya? Es decir, aquellos profesores, que hacen repetir a un porcentaje importante de sus alumnos, son percibidos como profesores de alta calidad, porque básicamente son profesores que son rigurosos, exigentes. Y por lo tanto, culturalmente, la regla de eliminar la repitencia es altamente resistida por los profesores, en la medida que se ve que eliminar la repitencia sería como bajar la calidad del sistema, ¿ya? Por lo tanto, no basta solamente la evidencia, sino que también cómo cambiamos la cultura, ¿no es cierto?, de aquello que se ve como legítimo o apropiado en un sistema escolar. Pero para quienes hemos estado envueltos, y en eso he tenido el honor de estar involucrado en cambios legislativos, ¿no es cierto?, en discusiones en el Congreso, en el caso de mi país, es que uno sabe que el cambio de reglas en educación ocurre principalmente a partir, y está bien que sea así, dado en una democracia, a partir de la discusión de grupos de interés, que tienen distintas ideologías, distintas perspectivas de lo que es bueno o malo para el sistema educativo. Y a veces, claro, también intereses corporativos, que muchas veces no necesariamente son los que están, ¿no es cierto?, realmente protegiendo el bien común. Entonces, si uno entiende que el cambio institucional viene de estos distintos ámbitos, y además entiende que el cambio institucional también, o sea, la educación en sí misma está dentro de un sistema de reglas mayor que tiene que ver con el sistema, digamos, modelo económico, ¿no es cierto?, entre ellos, llegamos a la conclusión entonces de que tenemos que asignarle el rol de la evidencia de acuerdo a estas preguntas para entender mejor cómo movilizar la evidencia. Entonces, primero que nada, sabemos que bajo este paradigma, los policymakers, ¿no es cierto?, tienen altos costos de cambio institucional. Cambiar reglas tiene un efecto político. Y por lo tanto, estamos llamados, como las instancias que estamos acá, la OECD, Educationorg, IEF y varios más que estamos en este tipo de cosas, a entender mucho mejor el ciclo político, ¿ya? No solamente de policy, pero de politics, ¿no es cierto?, de la política, para poder entender entonces dónde, cuándo y cómo incidir mejor en ese proceso político, ¿ya? Desde una evidencia, no digo salirnos desde nuestra idea de la rigurosidad de la evidencia, pero sí entender cómo se usa, cuándo, ¿no es cierto?, y dónde va a tener más efecto. El segundo tema tiene que ver con la importancia, por ende, de promover cambios culturales, y por lo tanto, la importancia de la innovación y también la importancia de resguardar y esto es algo que en algunos países de América Latina no está resguardado, que es la libertad de cátedra en las universidades. Sabemos en países, por ejemplo, en algunos países de América del Sur, y lo hemos hecho en algunos estudios de ecosistemas, donde los académicos dicen que si ellos critican una política pública, al año siguiente el financiamiento que viene del Ministerio de Educación se les reduce. Entonces, es importante entender que la evidencia, ¿no es cierto?, tiene que estar protegida de estos sesgos políticos para promover justamente este cambio cultural. Por otro lado, también sabemos que la policymaking tiene, por supuesto, en la política tiene un horizonte de tiempo que es menor al horizonte de tiempo que requieren las políticas educativas. Y por lo tanto necesitamos generar agendas y networks, redes, que sostengan estos acuerdos sociales más allá del gobierno de turno y por lo tanto pasar de políticas de gobierno a políticas de Estado, ¿no? Y finalmente, como digo, por supuesto que también los policymakers a veces no saben, ¿no es cierto?, cuál es, digamos, lo que está mostrando la evidencia, ¿no? Acordémonos de incluso el presidente del banco, del Fed, del banco, ¿no es cierto?, federal en Estados Unidos, Greenspan, cuando dijo que el modelo que ellos tenían para la inflación estaba simplemente malo y que ellos no pudieron ver nunca la crisis que venía del 2008 porque los modelos que tenían de crecimiento y de inflación estaban simplemente malos. Eso nuevamente a nivel del Banco Central de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Lo que quiero decir es que a veces también las instituciones más especializadas pueden tener los modelos erróneos y por lo tanto la importancia de los ecosistemas de innovación. Entonces, con eso en la mente, quisiera entonces decir, esto es más complejo, obviamente, de lo que hemos visto, en el sentido de lo que se conversa en la arena pública. ¿Qué es lo que hemos visto como movimiento de esta revolución de la evidencia? Bueno, uno puede agrupar que hay un primer movimiento, ¿no es cierto?, en los 80 y 90, que vino con el New Public Management, que básicamente fue una agenda de tratar de poner indicadores e información y resultados de lo que hace el Estado. Después nos movimos hacia los RCTs, ¿no es cierto?, como una manera importante y, por cierto, valiosa de dar de identificar los impactos. Pero después nos dimos cuenta que los RCTs no siempre eran consistentes. Y por lo tanto, tal como mostraba John, había que sistematizar, ¿no es cierto?, hacer systematic reviews. Pero el systematic review por sí mismo no era suficiente para movilizar la evidencia y es por eso que hemos estado ya en esta cuarta wave que tiene que ver con generar agencias de intercambio, de diseminación de evidencia. Pero eso es una manera nuevamente, y si bien es importante, es más bien lineal. Y la invitación entonces es a mirar esto desde el punto de vista de ecosistemas, que un poco esta cuarta wave de crear estos agencies, pero que las agencias por sí mismas no van a ser suficientes. Quisiera muy brevemente decir cuál es la situación de los ecosistemas entonces en América Latina, a partir de la investigación que hemos realizado en 8 países del sur global, desde Suma. Primero que nada, es decir, hay que decir que la generación de evidencias del sur es sumamente limitada, ¿ya? ¿Por qué es limitada? Bueno, es limitada entre otras cosas porque, como sabemos, ¿no es cierto?, el conocimiento es un bien público, es difícil de proteger, más allá de que uno pueda poner algún tipo de copyright o patente, por definición, ¿no es cierto?, es muy difícil de proteger y por lo tanto, como todo bien público, en general se tiene que financiar con financiamiento público, que es justamente el que el Global South no tiene, ¿no es cierto? Y por lo tanto, que lo que ocurre es que la mayoría de la evidencia es generada desde el Global North, desde el norte global. Las metodologías, las teorías y las agendas vienen del norte global. Y incluso cuando abarcan temas del sur global, son hechas por investigadores del norte global. Aquí hay, por ejemplo, en este gráfico, esto solamente para efectos demostrativos, estos son revistas científicas del ámbito del desarrollo económico y social. El 73% de los artículos vienen del del norte global y apenas 16% del sur global. Esto muestra simplemente el sesgo que hay en temas de la producción de conocimiento. Y eso obviamente hace que, tal como nos mostraba Nora en el caso de la OECD, que ya si para el norte global es poco relevante, imagínense lo que es para el sur global, ¿no? Lo otro que vemos, muy brevemente, que tiene que ver con que hay muy pocas instancias, y por eso la importancia de KIX y el trabajo que venimos haciendo con GBE y IDRC a través de estos hubs, es que hay una baja intensidad de lo que se llama face-to-face exchange, o sea, intercambios cara a cara. Y sabemos por la teoría del conocimiento, de que el conocimiento, una parte del conocimiento es explícita, pero una parte muy importante del conocimiento es implícita, es decir, no es codificable a través de un paper o se puede poner en papel. Solo se puede aprender en la interacción, cara a cara. Y sin embargo, hay muy pocos instrumentos de financiamiento de intercambio entre países. El otro tema, para aquella parte del conocimiento que sí es codificable, o sea, la parte explícita del conocimiento, sabemos que la diseminación se hace especialmente a través de revistas, ¿no es cierto?, del norte global, como por ejemplo Springer y otras, que son grandes holdings de revistas científicas, que obviamente publican además en inglés. Por lo tanto, lo que vemos nuevamente es que hay una falta de posibilidad de no solamente acceder, por los costos que significa acceder a esas revistas, sino que también de poder diseminar aquel conocimiento que se genera desde el sur, por no contar con esos altos canales de difusión. El otro tema obviamente tiene que ver con que la validación, ¿no es cierto?, lo que Foucault llamaba gatekeepers, o la validación del conocimiento, básicamente tiene que ver con, bueno, con sistemas de reconocimiento que son en muchos casos otorgados a través de seminarios, premios, etcétera, que están más bien localizados en el norte global. Y para terminar, 3 temas importantes que tienen que ver con la baja inversión en I+D que hacen los países, la inexistencia o muy débil gobernanza que hay en nuestros países para poder canalizar las prioridades más importantes para las cuales se requiere investigación y desarrollo, y la baja intensidad de colaboración entre universidades y el Estado. Quisiera ir terminando simplemente poniendo 2 casos de cómo de la importancia de los ecosistemas. Este es un estudio que hicimos desde Suma, que es cuantitativo, pero tiene que ver con cómo influye la evidencia en la discusión normativa, ¿ya? Y la importancia de los ecosistemas. Muy brevemente, hay 2 grandes leyes que se han realizado el año 2008 y el año 2015, en el caso del sistema educativo chileno, la ley de subvención preferencial y la ley de inclusión. Aquí está cada una en una de las columnas. Y lo que quisimos mostrar es que desde el 2006 al 2015, entre medio de esos 2 años, hubo una especie de, si ustedes quieren, casi como un experimento natural, que fue el año cuando se creó una cantidad importante de centros de investigación financiados por el Estado, y se fortaleció la formación de manera muy importante de investigadores. Por lo tanto, entre una ley y la otra, es decir, entre el 2008 y el 2015, hubo una explosión realmente, en términos de que no tengo tiempo acá de mostrar, de papers, de estudios en educación, de investigadores involucrados en educación. Y entonces lo que muestran estas tablas es simplemente lo que ocurrió en la discusión parlamentaria. Es decir, ¿qué ocurrió? ¿Quiénes incurrieron? ¿Quiénes participaron de la discusión de estas 2 leyes? Esto es bien interesante porque en el Congreso se establece la historia de cada ley, es decir, todas las personas que tuvieron una concurrencia pública y que dieron su testimonio para influir en las votaciones de estas 2 leyes. En el caso de la ley CEP, cuando no había un ecosistema muy fortalecido, apenas el 46% de todas las personas que testificaron ante el Congreso eran académicos. En el caso de la ley de inclusión, cuando estaban los centros de investigación de educación creados, con investigadores, con muchos estudios, 89% de quienes testificaron ante el Congreso eran académicos, académicos y, digamos, gente no del gobierno. Acá abajo podemos ver que los researchers en una ley eran apenas el 15% y se más que duplicaron en la ley de inclusión. Esto simplemente para mostrar cómo cuando hay un ecosistema robusto, esto logra permear incluso en el proceso político, que uno pensaría que es donde no hay mucha incidencia desde la academia. Finalmente, y muy brevemente ya en un último minuto, quisiera mostrar qué estamos haciendo en suma para efectos de, simplemente dos ejemplos, para efectos de lo que es la movilización de evidencia en política. Y quisiera hacerlo con dos ejemplos. Un primer ejemplo que tiene que ver con cómo movilizamos buena parte del trabajo que hace el Education Endowment Foundation a partir de su plataforma, pero lo pusimos al servicio de una política nacional, en este caso en Panamá, que fue la política nacional de recuperación de aprendizaje. Lo que hicimos fue, primero que nada, priorizar a partir de la plataforma, ¿no es cierto? Básicamente priorizar cuáles de las prácticas pedagógicas que están basadas en evidencia le hacían más sentido culturalmente a Panamá. Segundo, una vez que hicimos eso, pasamos del qué al cómo. Una cosa es saber qué prácticas son las efectivas y otra cosa es cómo se pueden implementar. Por lo tanto, desarrollamos con distintos expertos serie de guías de orientación para profesores, tremendamente, no solamente, o sea, no solo teóricas, sino que tremendamente prácticas, con ejemplos de planificación de clase, con ejemplos de actividades para que pudieran utilizarlas con sus estudiantes. Estamos hablando de aprendizaje colaborativo, aprendizaje socioemocional, en fin. También desarrollamos un mapa de innovación, es decir, identificamos en qué países estaban implementando prácticas innovadoras en estas 4 prácticas, donde que fuera más que una práctica pedagógica, sino que un modelo a nivel de programas en la escuela como un todo. Y finalmente, lo que hicimos fue realizar distintos encuentros pedagógicos con profesores, y lo más importante que es esta plataforma Esther, realizamos un curso, un webinar, donde se capacitaron los profesores panameños y se les hizo clase híbrida sobre cómo se hace una buena clase de comprensión, o sea, de aprendizaje colaborativo, etc. Fueron cursos que se hicieron de manera intensiva durante 2 semanas en el verano de los profesores, pero que después se transformó en proyectos de mejoramiento educativo para los profesores. Eso es un ejemplo. Y el segundo, muy brevemente, que ya no es a nivel digamos, profesores en servicio, sino que educación inicial. Y aquí simplemente mencionar, este es un proyecto que estamos terminando, ya estamos en la última etapa, que es, estamos reformando el currículum de formación inicial de los profesores del Caribe. Esto es una universidad, the University of West Indies, es una universidad que abarca más de 10 países, 10 islas del Caribe, es de manera casi hegemónica o única, y por lo tanto este currículum va a tener un efecto en 10 años, estimamos en 22% del stock de profesores del Caribe, y lo que estamos haciendo es reformar el currículum basado en evidencia en 3 grandes temas. 1, prácticas efectivas. 2, en temas de inclusión, cómo hacer que los profesores sean más inclusivos en sus prácticas y de construyendo sus valores. Y 3, en términos del practicum, cómo hacemos que efectivamente los profesores aprendan a partir de experiencias significativas. Simplemente quería mostrar ejemplos de cómo ir hacia adelante. Y para terminar, como a nivel de final thoughts, decir simplemente que creemos que hay que seguir promoviendo la evidencia desde el sur global. Creemos que es importante eso. Hoy día, como mostraba, simplemente en una de las disciplinas está totalmente sesgado, ¿no es cierto? La generación de conocimiento es desde el norte. No que eso sea malo en per se, sino que habla justamente de la falta de pertinencia y relevancia de ese research en el largo plazo. Además, que esté centrado en lo que llamamos poblaciones invisibles, no solamente en lo que es, ¿no es cierto?, el sistema como un todo de estudiantes, sino que a nivel de estudiantes que están más en el margen, los estudiantes que están privados de libertad, estudiantes que son migrantes, en fin. Lo otro es sintetizar evidencia no solamente a nivel del aula, sino que a nivel de reformas. Lo que nos pasa, y nos pasa mucho los que estamos acá, es que tenemos a ministros o altas autoridades preguntando ¿qué puedo hacer? ¿Qué reformas por ejemplo, de escalas salariales ha funcionado bien en el mundo? ¿O qué reformas justamente de temas de repitencia y cómo se hacen en distintos países del mundo? En fin, y eso no está sistematizado, y eso es algo que es sumamente importante. Tercer punto es que hoy día se ha transformado en una palabra muy importante la escalabilidad, ¿no es cierto? Casi un buzzword, scaling, ¿no es cierto? Impact, pero creemos que hay que tener cuidado en un solo tema. La palabra escalabilidad tiene, o puede pensarse, que tiene una visión de que el Estado es un gran escalador de programas o proveedor de una suma de programas. Y lo que creemos nosotros es que tenemos que ir hacia System Transformation, o sea, la transformación del sistema, que va en muchos casos mucho más allá de simplemente escalar programas que han sido piloteados inicialmente. Tiene que ver justamente transformar institucionalmente, ¿no es cierto?, las reglas del juego del sistema educativo. Y en eso la evidencia también tiene que jugar un rol. Por lo tanto, tenemos que fortalecer los sistemas de I+D, y para eso tenemos que, obviamente, comprometer a los gobiernos de un principio en el uso de la evidencia, no al final del proceso. Segundo, tenemos que comprometer a las universidades y otros actores del sistema para que efectivamente sean y permitan generar puentes entre una administración y otra, transformando estas políticas en políticas de Estado. Y finalmente, como digo, incluir dentro de nuestra perspectiva de diseminación de evidencia temas que tienen que ver con poder y cultura. Entender que esto no es simplemente a más evidencia, mejores decisiones, sino que es cómo movilizamos inteligente y estratégicamente la evidencia en un sistema democrático, pluralista, digamos, como son nuestras sociedades. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Javier, por la presentación, por estos ejemplos, ¿cierto?, tan interesantes de cómo en suma se trabaja el uso de evidencia. Solo recalcar lo que tú decías, la importancia de destacar una investigación del uso de evidencia desde los territorios, desde el sur, es lo que intentamos también hacer desde Suma, desde el KIX, y terminar quizás con la pregunta que tú empezaste esta presentación en relación a por qué estamos acá, por supuesto para hablar de evidencia, ¿cierto?, para fortalecer los sistemas, pero todo eso tiene un trasfondo muy importante y muy grande, ¿no?, que es buscar la mejora de los sistemas educativos. Así que nuevamente muchas gracias por tu presentación. Quería comentarles que por temas de tiempo, estamos muy pasados en el tiempo, vamos a reducir el espacio de preguntas, pero sí vamos a destacar una pregunta que estaba en el chat, que es para Nora, así que Nora, atenta ahí a la interpretación. La pregunta es de Jan, TGPE, agradece por supuesto tu presentación y quería saber si podrías explicar con un poco más de detalle qué significa la falta de investigación pertinente en la barrera sobre mecanismos lineales de tu presentación.
Thank you. It's funny because the person asked this question right after my presentation, and I actually think that both Suzanne and John and Javier answered this question so fantastically in a way. In the policy survey that we did not define relevance because what we wanted to know is the perception of the ministries that responded. Do they perceive it as relevant for their own policy needs? Do they perceive those types of research as relevant for the needs of practitioners in their context? So it's really just a perception. But then Suzanne elaborated really nicely about what relevant means for policy, for people who actually use evidence, and then Javier emphasized the relevance with respect to global north and global south and the context. So I think all of these are really important aspects.
Muchas gracias. Nora, no sé si Javier, Susan o Jan quieren agregar algo a esta pregunta o a esta visión. Si no es así, quiero... John, por favor, adelante.
I think I think that question of relevance really speaks to a lot of what Javier said about the ownership of evidence generation. So, we think really carefully about how we work with the end users of evidence. And I think if evidence for the Global South isn't generated by people within the Global South in conversation with the policymakers, the stakeholders and practitioners in the Global South, then it will very rarely speak to the relevant concerns. So I thought that was a really powerful message from Javier. And I think that relevance has so many different aspects to it. It can be about the outcomes that you care about and ensuring that the research is targeted at the right outcomes. It can be about the approaches, or it can be about the ownership locally of who is producing the evidence. And I think all of those interact.
I would agree. I think it reminds us to think about who you want to use the evidence you're producing, and think about that from the very start, because it alters what you work on, what questions you use, the ultimate outputs, etc. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Susan, tienes la mano levantada. Bueno, muchas gracias a los 4 expositores, a las 4 expositoras, por participar hoy día en esta jornada, por este espacio de diálogo, de conversación, de reflexión en torno al uso de evidencia. Y ya para cerrar esta jornada del día de hoy, recordar que mañana seguimos reflexionando, quiero dejar con ustedes a Florencio Ceballos. Él es oficial del programa del IDRC de Canadá, que nos va a dar las palabras de cierre. Florencio Ceballos es especialista senior del programa de intercambio de conocimiento e innovación KIX, es licenciado en Sociología, cuenta con un diploma de Certificado aprofundido en Ciencias de la Educación en la Universidad de París 8 y estudios de doctorado en Sociología. Florencio tiene más de 20 años de experiencia en el diseño e implementación de programas globales en desarrollo internacional y apoyo a la investigación. Gracias, Florencio.
Gracias, Maciel. Voy a ser muy breve porque ya veo que nos quedamos sin tiempo, desgraciadamente. Ha sido muy interesante todo lo que se ha conversado hoy día y yo lo interpreto, lo escucho además muy específicamente en el marco de lo que a nosotros nos toca hacer desde el Knowledge Innovation Exchange, desde KIX y más en general del trabajo que es de IDRC, del International Development Research Center, venimos desarrollando hace décadas. Y esta conversación que ustedes están teniendo y estos datos que están teniendo podrían ser muy fácilmente transferibles a otras áreas, digamos, en las que, por ejemplo, IDRC trabaja, como, por ejemplo, seguridad alimentaria, como, por ejemplo, desarrollo económico, u otras áreas en que los países también requieren de evidencia para desarrollar mejores políticas. En el caso de IDRC, voy a ponerlo aquí en algún momento, hemos desarrollado un marco, digamos, para entender nuestra investigación, que es el RQ+, es un marco un framework para entender la calidad de la investigación orientada al desarrollo, pero quería señalar específicamente respecto a KIX que estos elementos que ustedes han mencionado son específicamente los que hemos tratado de combinar, investigación que sea aplicada, que sea localizada, lo cual no quiere decir solo investigación para un país, sino que se involucran localmente los actores involucrados, que sea orientada hacia la escalabilidad de, por ejemplo, las innovaciones que se están estudiando, que rescate las prioridades que junto con GPS se han ido desarrollando como prioridades de política educativa en esos países. Pero además, y con esto quisiera terminar, 2 cosas. Por una parte, entender que en el caso nuestro al menos, trabajamos en contextos muy difíciles muchas veces, en que ni esa institucionalidad, ni la capacidad de investigación está necesariamente ahí, en países en conflicto o saliendo de situaciones de conflicto, etc. Y eso también tiene una nota metodológica, que tiene que ver con, Javier lo señalaba en su intervención, con cómo uno desarrolla investigación local, aplicada, relevante, en la cual participan investigadores locales como parte de los equipos y los lideran, sin caer, entre comillas, en la dictadura del RCT. Es decir, nosotros estamos desarrollando mucha investigación que es de tipo más cualitativo, que es de tipo muchas veces codiseñado con actores locales, que es muy localizado, pero que entendemos que para ubicarse en ciertos debates, en ciertos espacios públicos de debate de evidencia, necesitamos hacer más, porque la naturaleza de esa investigación necesita ser agregada para poder ser tomada en serio, por decirlo así, aunque granularmente sea muy importante para las realidades de un país en particular. Entonces creo también que hay una reflexión que hacer sobre la naturaleza de la investigación y el estatus que se le asigna a ciertos tipos de investigación en ese contexto. Sé que estamos pasados, así que no voy a hablar más por ahora. Quería agradecerles por estas estupendas presentaciones. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Florencio. Nuevamente, gracias a los y las ponentes. Por favor, les pedimos que si pueden responder una breve encuesta que está en el chat. No, esto para ayudarnos para que tengamos feedback en relación a esta jornada y para enriquecer también la jornada de mañana. Queremos agradecer a todas las personas que asistieron a través de Zoom, a través de las redes sociales. Los invitamos a seguir también nuestras redes sociales de KIX LAC, Suma o XGP IDRC. Y recuerden que mañana nos encontraremos en este mismo sitio, en este mismo horario, a través del mismo link, para la segunda sesión donde conoceremos experiencias regionales y nacionales. Contaremos con las presentaciones de Ian McPherson, de GP KIX, José Mauricio Pineda Rodríguez, el Ministro de Educación de El Salvador, Eslin Nadet, Senior Technical Especialista de OEX, y con el Ministerio de Guyana. Muchas gracias por su participación, gracias nuevamente a los expositores, y hasta muy pronto.
Thank you everyone for